Have you ever wondered what it's like working on American flag small cruise ships, not the big giant ones? Well, if you have, today I'm going to tell you what it was like for me way back in the day. In fact, when I got started, I was in my late 20s, 28, 29 or so, and I was from the East Coast back on Cape Cod, so I was always used to being by the ocean. And I ended up going out and visiting my brother, who was living in Long Beach, California at the time. And I just stayed with him for about a month or so. And my cousin up in Seattle offered to have me come stay with him and his wife for a while. And so I did that. And at that point, I didn't really have any direction. I used to have a painting company back on the East Coast, back in Cape Cod. And, but that just wasn't going everywhere where I wanted it to go, let's just say that. And so I ended up in Seattle, and my cousin used to be a navigational officer on large cruise ships. And there was only one American flagged cruise line at the time that was called American Hawaii Cruise Lines. Obviously, they cruised in Hawaii. And so anyway, he said to me, why don't you go down and meet with the people down at Wilderness Cruise Line? So that's small cruise ships, like, 70 to 150 passengers per ship. So small cruise ship cruising is different than a large ship. I mean, large ships is, you have all this entertainment, you have, slides, and you're hitting golf balls off the deck. With small cruise ships, you're really getting in with nature. So we really cater to the older demographic because they've seen it all on the big cruise ships. And so by being on the small ones, you're right down by the water. So you see the humpback whales. I mean, when they come up and they breach, or they just blow, they get air. I mean, we'd be so close to them, you could hear it. We'd cut the engines. So it was you and nature. And then we'd also, be really close to the shoreline. And so, you could see bears and everything. When you're on those big giant cruise ships, even large humpback whales look like minnows when you're on those giant ships. On our ships, you really got a chance to understand the scale. So anyway, I was in my late 20s at the time. And so I said, go on down to Wilderness Cruise Lines and speak with them. So I did. And it turned out I got a job as a deckhand. And so they flew me down to California. I can't remember exactly where. It might have been Long Beach or something. Then we had to reposition the ship back up to Seattle to get the ship finalized, ready for having passengers come on board. So that's when you do repositioning. Repositioning it's absolutely brutal. So you have a skeleton crew, and just the open sea on a very small cruise ship is very different than on the large cruise ships. I mean, you're taking the waves off the beam all the way up from, Southern California all the way up to Seattle, which, takes a few days to do. And so it's basically, it's a throw fest. Let's just put it that way, most of the time. So all we would have for those types of trips would be, the navigational officers, obviously, and the deckhands, which is what I was. So we'd be the deck crew. And then you'd have, one chef. So obviously we have to eat. And then you'd have one engineer. So that was basically it. And to give you an idea just how rough it is, I mean, we put bow plates on. These are steel plates over the window, on the lower windows of the ship itself, because when the waves come in and they hit it so hard that the entire ship can shudder. It's so bad. So anyway, that was what we did. Was we got it positioned up to Seattle, and then we took on the rest of the crew, and then we would get ready to then take on passengers from there. I just wanted to mention one funny story, or at least it's funny to me. When I was staying with my brother down in California, during that short period of time, he ended up on a TV show called The Love Connection back in the day, and that was hosted by Chuck Woolery, who was a very, very cool guy. So I was in the audience along with a couple other of my brother's friends. And so they go out on, if you don't know the show, they hook you up, a guy and a girl, and they go on a date, and the Love Connection show pays for your date. I think so. They go out on a date, and then you're supposed to come back and then tell everybody, whether it was a Love Connection or not. And so anyway, the date didn't go that great. It wasn't a connection. I wouldn't say it didn't go great. They just weren't a connection. Let's just put it that way. So there was no animosity. But the thing is for the show, right, they want to get good ratings, and they know what's going to happen is, like, both parties, if it's not a love connection, then what happens is they agree, like, hey, I'm not going to bash you, you don't bash me, and everything. But the show itself is like, well, if you don't have a love connection, then, we want a little bit of a little bickering back and forth type of thing coming out. So anyway, that's basically what happened. So long story short, the crowd was definitely on my brother's side. Let's just put it that way. So, like, every time she would say something like, oh, he was blah, 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 then the crowd, and of course we're in the audience and we're like, boo. And I felt bad for her, but anyway, my brother, every time he would say something, is like, everybody's like, yay. Like, so anyway, she ended up threatening him, I think, with a curling iron after the show. So, anyway, I'm sorry, it's not a cruise ship thing, but it was just kind of funny because I'd never been part of a studio audience thing. Obviously, you're in the LA area, and so that Hollywood, everything's going on out there. So it was kind of funny coming from Cape Cod. You don't have anything like that, and you go out there, and all of a sudden you're on TV and everything. So anyway, that was a side note. So now let's get back to the cruise ship life. All right, so let me just say something about the passengers, right? As a deckhand, we didn't have a huge amount of interaction with the passengers themselves. That's generally the hotel staff that does that. They're in tune. They're always, they're catering to the passengers themselves. Whereas the deckhands, our job as deckhands is to maintain the ship, get us, we get on the dock, we handle the lines, we paint the ship, we sweep, we handle the luggage of things, the maintenance of we're electricians, we're carpenters, we're plumbers, and believe me, like on the first ship I was on, we had plumbing problems. So yeah, I was a plumber for sure. And so anyway, we're always we're like on the outer decks more often. We're outside the decks, and we do engine rounds and things like that. But the hotel staff, they're the ones who take care of the passengers. So they're indoors more often inside the ship. And even when it's, outdoors, they might bring the passengers some things here or there. But, they take care of the dining room as well. They take care of the bedding. So they turn over the beds every day. They give them towels. They do the washing and things like that for the passengers. So I didn't have a lot of experience with that because I was a deckhand. And so anyway, I just wanted to give you an idea. There's a difference between which part of, what you end up getting on the ship as. So if you want to deal with passengers all the time, then you're like, you're just personable and everything, then, being a CSR, a customer service representative, that's what they were. So if you were into that, then that's what you want. You want to be part of the hotel staff. As if you want to be part of the deck staff where you're, I'm an introvert, right? So I wasn't great with, I was pretty good with passengers, but it was limited. So that made it easier for people like myself. So our limitation would be more like, they might come up to you and they might ask something about, the lines or the ship itself and things like that. So that was, for the deck, that was kind of our interaction with passengers. We also helped them to disembark and to embark back onto the ship. So we would be on the gangway, make sure, don't trip, get on here, make sure we got the count. Everybody's on board. We'd work with the cruise coordinator for that. So that was ultimately her thing. And so, you don't want to leave without your passengers. So anyway, we'd get the gangway back on, get the ship off the dock and everything. So anyway, it's more maintenance type of thing. So that was what I did. And to become an officer, which is, so I'm wearing this uniform. This is first mate's set of stripes. And a lot of people think like, oh, how many stripes depends on, what your rank is. And that is true, but there's different departments. So like I said, there's hotel and then there's the deck staff. So like a hotel manager would be the top person in the hotel staff, whereas the captain is the top person in the deck staff. But the thing is at least on our ships, the hotel manager also had 3 stripes, but they didn't have an anchor. So you can see I have an anchor next to my stripes. And so if you had an anchor, then you're a navigational officer. You have a license. You're a licensed captain. In other words, you have to take exams through the Coast Guard to get a license to be a navigational officer. So even if you were a bosun, would be a navigational officer. And a bosun would have a single stripe with an anchor next to it, but that would outrank a hotel manager who would have 3 stripes. And I don't remember what it was they had next to theirs, but it had something to do with hotel type of things. But at any rate, all people who have the anchors, at least on our ship, it could be a different symbol on different ships, on the larger ships. Every cruise line can have their own symbol. For us, it was an anchor. So if you're a licensed captain, it doesn't matter how many stripes you have. Then you're always a higher tier than somebody in the hotel staff. So, and that used to confuse the little kids because we didn't have a lot of them, but occasionally they'd come on and they'd be like, "Oh, so and so's a higher ranked," and the deck would go like, "No, that's not how it works," and they'd have to explain it. But that's neither here nor there. The thing that I wanted to point out is the jobs are very different. So if you're a people person, then you want to be in the hotel staff. If you're, I wouldn't say not a people person, but if you just like to work with your hands, you don't mind being outside. I mean, there's plenty of times, especially up in Alaska, where it's raining and it's windy and it's pretty miserable. At times, I'm not saying like it's always like that, but there are times when it's pretty rough to be working on the outside as a deckhand. The other thing about being a deckhand or anybody on the deck staff, so that means the officers as well, is you work around the clock 24/7. In other words, the ship runs 24/7. Even if it's at a dock, it's considered running. There always has to be an officer of the watch. So that's the person who logs into the logbook. And that's usually the captain, the first mate, which is what I was second command. And then the second mate would be the third in command. And so we would rotate. You'd be on the bridge on 4-hour watches. So it'd be 4 hours, then you have to log out. And this is all based on Coast Guard regulations. So then the next person would come in, and then it's almost like Star Trek, right? You have the con. So you have to come in, you have to log on. And once you do that, you're basically in charge of the ship. Now, people say like the captain is always in charge of the ship, and that is true. But on the bridge, when you sign in the logbook and you sign in, whether you're a first mate or a second mate or a captain, you're in charge of the bridge, and everything that happens to the ship is your responsibility, period. So the captain might be responsible for everything, but the captain has to sleep too. So if the first mate is on watch and they run it aground, then it isn't the captain who's going to lose their license. It's the person who was signed in who is going to lose their license. So they're the ones responsible. So just wanted to let you know, that's kind of the hierarchy of the ship. And so as deck staff, we didn't have a tremendous amount of interaction with the hotel staff itself. I mean, obviously you'd walk through the ship and you'd meet some of them, but they're doing their thing, right? They're taking care of the passengers and they're doing thing. And occasionally as a deckhand, you might go through and go like, and a hotel person, a CSR, was so like, "Hey, we're kind of behind. Would you help us, set the dining room table for dinner or lunch or whatever it might be?" And of course, we'd always, if we weren't in some kind of a situation, it was like, well, we have to get the ship ready to, to dock. If there wasn't a situation like that, then sometimes we, as deckhands, we would surely help them out. So, and there were times when the hotel staff was just, they could come out and do things like handle a line or something, but we didn't really let them do that type of thing. So, but anyway, there isn't a huge amount of interaction between the two groups. Now, where there was some interaction was the cruise coordinators, the cruise coordinator is also a member of the hotel staff. So they're the primary person who really is interacting with the passengers the most. I mean, they're on the microphone, they're telling you all about this glacier or this area, and then they go on the tours when you're docking and they go around on the tours with the passengers, and then they're doing a lot of that talking. So they really have to have a lot of knowledge of all the stops and all the areas that we're in, so that when they tell you about it over the PA system on the ship, or if passengers come up to them, they have to have answers for things. So kudos to the cruise coordinator, but that also means that they had a lot of time with passengers. And the hotel manager could also have a lot of time with the passengers as well. So there were certainly times when both of them, the cruise coordinator or the hotel manager, would actually come up to the bridge and hang out with the navigational officers and a deckhand. There's always a deckhand on the bridge with the navigational officer, because you have to have two pairs of eyes, or if something happens to the navigational officer, obviously you got to have a second person up there. So just part of regulations. And anyway, they would come up sometimes and they were just like, I just need a break, right? Because, a ship goes all the time, and it doesn't matter whether you're a navigational officer or, another member of the crew. You can be like, oh, I'm off duty. Now this is my time. But you really have no place to go. Like, you can go to your quarters. Well, actually, let me just tell you about your quarters. Your quarters are small. You share them with other people. So crew members are sharing with crew members. Even the captain, at least on our ship, shared a cabin with me as the first mate. He and I shared a cabin. Now, we didn't spend a lot of time together, because what would happen is, with the navigational officers, like I was saying, it's a 24/7 thing for navigational officers and deckhand. So you'd be on the bridge for 4 hours, but then you had another 4 hours of doing whatever your secondary primary duty was. So like for second mates, that would be taking care of the charts. Updating the charts. So the Coast Guard's always updating things. So you have to update the charts, and there was other duties with that. And you may have to be at the gangway when, loading, offloading passengers, just standing there. And then like the first mate, I was also licensed as a firefighter too, so I took courses and got certified as a firefighter as well. In fact, all navigational officers did that. But the first mate, part of their duties was also to head the fire team, so the deckhands and stuff. So we'd do drills, practice drills of things that could happen, which you would never hope would ever happen. And then also the first mate was also in charge of the deck staff. So like all the deckhands fell under me. So I would have to give them their daily tasks, tell them what they have to do, and then communicate with them, with a list of what they needed to do. And anyway, you're in charge of them. And then you're also in charge of ordering all supplies for the ships. You'd run low. So the deckhands would have to give you feedback. And so I'd have to place the orders for that. That goes back to the office, and then you'd come into your main port, which for us was Juneau, and then when we get supplies, we'd get stores for the galley itself, so the chefs and things, obviously they got to get food and everything, but then the supplies that I would order for the deck team would also come in at that time as well. Let's see, what else there's? Well, let me just say, so I did mention that the passengers, are mostly older, and that's true, because what you may not realize, even though the ships are nowhere near as nice as the big giant ships, right? They're just gorgeous, right? I mean, if you've ever been on them, you know what I'm talking about. The small cruise ships, they've been handed down from one company to another. In fact, this company that I worked for was Alaska Sightseeing Cruise West, But the first company that I worked for when I repositioned that ship from California up to Seattle, that was called Wilderness Cruise Lines, Cruise West, I think is what it was. Neither one of those companies actually exists anymore. In fact, I think one of them, so like the first ship I was on for Wilderness Cruise Lines, the ship I was on was called the Seabird, and they also had one called the Sea Lion, and they were sister ships. They were almost exactly identical. There was only small differences between them, and I think the Seabird, maybe the Sea Lion as well, are now owned by National Geographic. So I'll have to look that up. Maybe if I can find it, I'll put a picture of what the ship was. But I can tell you that the ships wouldn't look the same, because when they go from one company to another company, you're going to get a completely different, paint job. They may even change the name of the ship itself, and then the interior, undoubtedly you're going to gut it, and you may not even have the same amount of cabins, so they'll completely strip it out and start all over, new carpeting, new amenities, everything. So I have no idea what they look like now, but again, this was back in the mid to late 90s that I started, I think, in the mid 90s and ended up at the late 90s is when I stopped working for what was Alaska Sightseeing Cruise West at the time. And so, why did I end that career? Well, it was because they didn't allow relationships. Now, I can't remember whether they did or not on Wilderness Cruise Lines. I know it happened. For sure, relationships happened. It was definitely on Wilderness Cruise Lines. On Alaska Sightseeing, I'm sure it happened as well. And in fact, it's how I met my wife. My wife, in fact, was a cruise coordinator. So there was a season where we met each other. And so the two of us, we ended up becoming a thing during the off season. So the off season, in the winter time, you can't be up in Alaska. It's too cold, everything. So the ships come down back to Seattle, and then they get worked on. So they get raised up. The hull is scraped, barnacles are taken off, new coats of paint. The ship is completely gutted and everything. And so I used to work in the yard all the time. Very few people work in the yard in the off season. I hated it because, of course, there's no heat. There's nothing, right? Because you're in the yard. You're in a shipyard, right? So the ship, you're in Seattle. It's freezing cold out. You're exposed to the elements. And if you've ever been to Seattle, it rains a lot. So especially in the winter, anyway. And so nobody wanted to work in the off season. But unfortunately for me, every captain that I worked for always said, "Steve, I need you in the yard." Every time. I never had a season where I didn't work in the yard. So I was a carpenter. I learned a lot, right? Rebuilding the ships every year. That's kind of like a full season. Most people have the whole rest. I don't know how many months it was off. The regular crew would have it off. And then the next year, you could be on a different ship. I can't remember how many ships Alaska Sightseeing had. I want to say we had 6 or 7 or something. I can't remember them all, but I was on the Spirit of Alaska, and I also spent some time on the Spirit of the Glacier Bay. And again, those ships don't exist anymore. At least the name doesn't anymore. So again, they're with another company. I can't remember. I remember seeing an image of a ship that I think was the Spirit of Alaska for another company. And I'll look it up online. If I can, I'm going to put it here somewhere. I'll show you a picture of the ship that I think is the Spirit of Alaska, and whatever the name it is now for the other company. But it looks a lot like that ship that I work on. So I'm surmising that it was, in fact, the Spirit of Alaska. So let me come back. Now, the deck side, I said it's 24/7. The thing is, you work 4 hours on the bridge as a navigational officer, and that would be the same for the deckhand. So they would rotate through, and they would be, your extra eyes. They'd be on watch with you. So you work 4 hours on the bridge, 4 hours on whatever your extra duties were as an officer. As a deckhand, it's just doing deckhand stuff. As an officer, you do that, and then you get to sleep for 4 hours. And then you got to get back up, and then you got to do another stint on the bridge. And then after that 4 hours, you get to go back to sleep again for 4 hours. So it ended up being, a 24-hour day. But the thing about deck staff and navigational officers is you don't get to sleep much. And the fact is, if you're like me, like I'm an insomniac, I rarely slept at all, quite frankly, because it could take me 4 hours to fall asleep. Well, I only get 4 hours to lie down. So, if you have a hard time sleeping, deck staff's not the thing for you. The thing with the hotel staff is, yes, everybody works 12 hours out of the day, but with the deck staff, you're going at all hours of the day and night. Whereas the hotel staff, it's more like a regular job, except a long job, right? 12 hours as opposed to, your land-based job of 8 hours. You have to go out and you have to work 12 hours, but then you could be off. So if you really just wanted to go to bed, well, you'd eat. And then if you just wanted to go to bed, you can then do that. But with the deck staff, it doesn't work like that out. So if you're an insomniac, being in the deck staff is it's very hard to do if you have sleep problems. So anyway, those are things to consider. As far as passengers go, again, I said, they're older, and the reason why we got these people was because they've been on the big cruise ships. Lots of them have cruised many times on the big ships, and they all start to, become the same thing. So all of a sudden they were like, I really want to see whales up close. I really want to see bears on the shoreline. And then when we go up to the glaciers, being Glacier Bay National Park, beautiful place. And you go up there, and you're right down there. You got all these glacier flows, these big icebergs, and you're weaving the ship way through that. And when the glaciers calved, and believe me, they calve a lot up there. You'd be surprised, at least back in the day. Whew, they calved all the time. So we'd be up there, and you'd turn the engines off, and you can literally hear the glaciers moving. So you're hearing the cracking sound, constant cracking sound, and you'd be panning after, and you go like over there, because we've seen it all. We could tell when something is about ready to go. And they go, over here, go take a look at this. And people go over there, and they get their cameras ready, and glaciers falling down. And then because our ships were small and you had all this ice around you, we'd call down to the galley real quick and say, hold on of everything, because the wake that's going to be created by those massive chunks of ice falling off, the whole ship's going to rock. So as a navigation officer, you have to get that ship turned into where the wake's going to come from. And the whole ship would be up and down. And so the CSRs would be like holding all the silverware and the glasses down in the dining room area. And the gallery would just like holding on to things. And the passengers would be like, we'd say, hold on to something, it's coming. And at first it could just be a really slow wave. And they're like, oh, that's nothing. All of a sudden it's getting bigger and bigger. Anyway, that is the up close and personal experience that the small ships offered. And the thing is, those ships were way more expensive, even though the amenities were nowhere close to that of the big giant cruise ships that you're used to seeing. Didn't have the entertainment, none of that stuff. It was 100% about being one with nature. And let me tell you, you would absolutely, positively experience that, whether it's orcas, humpback whales, seals, bears. I mean, we'd see bears all the time on the side. So we'd be up there, with the binoculars looking for them. And if we spotted something, we'd, call down to the cruise coordinator and say, like, hey, we spotted bear off the starboard side there, 2:00. And then cruise coordinator get on the microphone and tell people, hey, even if you're at, you're at lunch or your breakfast, they're like, hey, if you want to see bears, hop off and, your food will still be there. Hop out there and, get some pictures and everything. And of course, we stop the ship and everything. It's like on the big cruise ships, you just go. On the small cruise ships, it'd be like, hey, we're going to stop. There's bears there. People want to see bears. We'll stop. So we did that. That was the kind of freedom we had as navigational officers to cater to the experience of the passengers themselves. Let's see, what else? Oh, pay. How does it pay to be on a cruise ship? Well, let me tell you, it really depends on the ship you're on. So like I said, last, because we had several ships. And so some ships were nicer than other ships. And so the nicer ones, they also had more passengers on board. Yeah, they had a few more crew, but it wasn't a ton more. And so because the ships are nicer, and then they still have very good itineraries, then really the crew was paid mostly with tip, or I should say mostly, but a good part of their income came from tips. So if we saw a ton of wildlife, then the crew made out like bandits, right? So they would get a base salary, and so this is like 30 years. I can't believe this uniform still fits me. It's been 30 years. So they would get paid, I think, don't quote me on this, because this is 30 years ago. I think they got somewhere around, I want to say $60, $65 or something per day. Which, he's like, who can live on that? Well, remember, you're living on a ship, so you're not paying for room and board, right? So you get fed and you have a room. I mean, your room sucks. I mean, you're sharing it with a bunch of other people and everything, and you get a little bunk. So, and you have no privacy. So that's cruise ship life, right? So you'll have no privacy whatsoever on a small cruise ship. It doesn't even matter if you're an officer. It's the same for everybody. So they make like $65 a day, I think. And then the tips with the tips, I think they can be getting between about 110 up to about $160 a day. And I heard from some, there were some ships that were bigger than the ship I was on, the Spirit of Alaska, like the Spirit of 98 or the Spirit of Discovery were larger than the ship I was on. And hotel managers would sometimes brag with one another, so they would keep in contact with one another, and they would brag when they just the tips were just huge. And so there were times when the crew members actually might make $200 a day for a trip, whatever that trip was. And then of course you get new passengers, and then you just may suck in that one. Maybe you didn't see a lot of wildlife, or the people were just more frugal, didn't have as much money. So, it was an up and down thing for them. Now, as an officer, I got paid, and again, this is a long time because I'm trying to remember, but I think I got paid as second in command. I think I got paid about $130 a day. Now, that was back in the mid and late 90s at the time, so I don't know what they would pay now. But it's funny because the crew would oftentimes make more money than I made. I think the only person who would consistently make more money than the crew, and that's not even every time, but for the most part, the captain would be the only person who would make more money. And also the captain, I never asked the captain, but I think they probably got the same base pay even in the off season. Whereas people like myself, I would get a different pay when I worked in the yard than I did when I was, navigating the ship. So, and it was less. So I didn't even make $130 a day in the off season, even though the job was worse, kind of sucked. But it was also 8-hour days. They weren't 12-hour days, and I could go home at night. So I guess, that's a benefit. So anyway, if you think you're going to get rich on a cruise ship as an American, then that's not going to be the case. And I'm sure it's higher pay now, but when it comes to the big cruise ships, I've heard stories where, they can make at least the people in a dining room, and those guys are just amazing memories. They can remember passengers from ages ago, and some of those guys can make absolute bank, but Americans aren't on those cruise ships. They don't have American crew on those. So the only place you can, as an American, get into the cruise business is to be on these small cruise ships. Now, again, I don't know if, National Geographic, this is where I think the Seabird and the Sea Lion ended up being bought out. Those ships ended up with National Geographic. I have no idea what they pay. So, I mean, I wish I could tell you. So I'm trying to tell you what it's like on the cruise ships and what you got paid. But the pay itself is, and we're talking about the mid to late 90s compared to today. So it could be better or worse. I have no idea. But I would guess that your experience of what your work life would be, everything that I've just said now, is probably very comparable even today. So just the pay would be, I'm sure, would be different in some way, but probably not hugely different, I imagine, because the ships are still the same size and they could have fewer or more cabins, just depending on when they gutted the ship and they rebuilt the interior, how many cabins they decided. They might have decided, well, let's make the cabins a little bigger, let's make them a little smaller or something. So you could have a few more or less cabins. So, and I'm sure they charge them more money now than then, but back in the day, I think that passenger costs were, I want to say, like the low end for a 4 or 5 day trip was like $4,500 per passenger. So crazy high. I can imagine it's probably like $6,000 now. So who knows what the pay is like, but I'm sure the job, whether you decide to be on the deck staff or the hotel staff, then the job itself is probably very similar. I can't see how it would change. And the season should be roughly the same, unless you're on a ship that actually goes down to the Caribbean during the winter months. So like we were just up in Alaska, and then we'd spend a little time down in British Columbia and Canada, Victoria, and places like that. But for the most part, that's basically what it's like to work on a cruise ship. For an American flag cruise ship, small cruise ship, not the large ones. And so that's really all I have to say. Can't believe this uniform still fits. And if you have any questions at all, just go ahead and ask them down in the comments below here, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. And if you want to hear a little more about this, you're like, how did you meet your wife? I said I met her on the cruise ship, but I can give you a little more detail on that if you like, or just anything else. If you have something that I missed, I know I rambled because I'm not used to talking to a camera. So, don't flame me in the comments. It is what it is. Like I said, I'm an introvert. This is the best I can do. So hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know. Until then, I'm Steven, Unfiltered, and I'll catch you in the next one.